Our text tonight will be in Esther. Actually, it's going to be in several of these books, but Esther chapter 4 and verse 12. Esther, at the end of the historical books in the Old Testament, has a very important role. I know that there has been debate among some about the book, whether it should be included in the Bible, but it fits perfectly and has been accepted. In Esther chapter 4 and verse 12, I'd like us just to read a few verses here about the scene where Esther is being made aware by Mordecai, her cousin, I guess, and
his uncle.
Uncle.
Yeah.
Okay, uncle. But he's playing the role of father to her. He's raised her as a daughter, and they have a very close relationship. And now, at this point, she is queen, and Mordecai has heard that back in chapter 3 and verse 6 that Haman, the Agagite, has decided to destroy all of the Jewish people. And he had the power and the influence to do that in the Persian kingdom. And so word now is actually 4 years later, I believe. I think the offense, let's see if I've got this right. In any case, let me just read this to you. And they told Mordecai that Esther had said, when Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." That last phrase, who knows? Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Now, there's a concept that he expresses here that I think is in the background in all of these books that we've been studying here lately with Rhodes. After the temple was destroyed, or a little bit before that, and the temple was destroyed, and the world in which God's people lived, in that world, there was this big question mark. And you see that Mordecai answers that question by faith. He believes that God is what? He's controlling, or he is accomplishing his purpose as he will. Now, the promise that God had made to Abraham, ultimately being fulfilled in Jesus Christ, depended on the Jewish people being alive for Jesus' birth. The promises God had made to Jeremiah, that they would return after 70 years of captivity. They knew about this. Mordecai knew about this. All the Jews knew about the promises of God to the prophets. Now, here is apparently a challenge to that promise. Now, Again, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. The word that I'm looking for is one that really we've made up, and yet we use it as if it's a Bible word. The providence of God. Okay? What is the providence of God?
His will.
Okay, it's God's will to do what?
To do what He wants to.
Okay, but what He wants to do, He's expressed. It's written down.
He has a reason for all the things that's going on in life. Because first it had to do with the coming of His Son.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then to give
That's
us,
what He wanted.
Yeah. To give us
And why did He want that? He wanted that in order to save the lost. He wanted to save the souls of men who were lost in sin. And it required the death of Christ, the death of a particular person descended from Abraham, descended through David, as a part of this people that were called the Israelites, or at this time it's mainly the Jews, the tribe of Judah, although the other tribes were still alive and they were in various parts in the empire. But in tonight's study, I'd like us to wrestle a little bit with that word, providence, because what that literally is talking about is that God provides for His plan to be fulfilled. He provides for His children. He provides all that He's promised us. And these truths have not changed. Now, we live in a time in which the providence of God is blended in together with all of the miracles that we read about in the first century. And there's clearly that is the providence of God. But what's the difference between the signs and the wonders and the miracles of Jesus and the apostles in the first century and this context and the idea of the providence of God for us in our time? Think about that with me a little bit. Because the fact that God has given us the privilege of prayer, that tells us that God cares about what goes on in this earth, and that He is willing to participate in our lives. And God will answer prayers. How will He do that? How does God answer prayers?
He listens.
Okay, He listens.
He knows our hearts. He knows whether He will or won't answer.
Mm-hmm.
We can't expect, it says the effectual fervent prayer of the righteous man avails much.
That's a promise, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's a promise of God.
And also it points out that there's more than one person praying for the same thing will have more effect, possibly more effect.
There's greater influence there. What that implies is God will do something that He would not have otherwise done. If prayer means anything, it means that we don't live in a fatalistic world in which God's already decided what He's going to do. It doesn't matter whether we do anything or not. And it doesn't matter whether we pray. He's going to do what He's going to do. And it's easy for us to fall into that trap, isn't it? Because we don't see the kind of miraculous activity that was going on in the first century. So what now? Does God not answer prayer?
Yes, He does.
He does, okay? Which means that God will do things that would not normally otherwise have happened. In other words, the ideas that many people have is what's called determinism, and that you completely determine and are in charge of your future. Right or wrong? A little bit right, a little bit wrong. Not completely right. It's not completely, yes, you are in charge, and your choices are essential to your success and to your future. But the difference is, God has offered to help. God has offered to give us a better life than we would be able to have otherwise without Him. Now what that means is God is willing to intervene. Now that's the whole issue of the Bible from beginning to end. God loves us. God has made promises. And God is faithful. Faithful. What does that mean? He will keep every promise. He will keep every word. Now, He will not keep the promises that we presume that He made. I know a lot of people feel like that they can obligate God to do what they want. Now, God's not that. God's not our puppet. But we can persuade Him. Now, the reason that this issue is important in the book of Esther and in the book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra and the book of Daniel all surrounds the fact that God had chosen Israel. And in their golden age, with Solomon on the throne, Solomon built the temple. And they moved the Ark of the Covenant from a tent, and they moved it into this solid structure of wood and stone and beauty that had been especially designed. God Himself giving gifts to the artisans who carved designs in the pillars, and we can only imagine. We have some description of it. It was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And then in Jeremiah, we've already read how that the people would trust in the very existence of that temple as if it were an idol. That God would not allow His temple to be destroyed. And Jeremiah called out, he said, these people are not willing to reform their lives. They're living immoral lives. They're living apostate lives. They're worshiping all kinds of gods. They're bringing their idolatry even into the temple. They're defiling the city of Jerusalem. They're defiling every high place. And they're committing adultery, and they're committing fornication, and they are lying, and they are stealing, and they are abusing the poor, and all of the list of things that are described in the prophets, the book of Amos, the book of Hosea, and the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah. These prophets describe the behavior of Israel that Jeremiah was saying, if you don't clean this up, God will carry you away captive. And at some point, God tells him, it's too late. It's going to happen now. Just get ready for it. And the temple is going to be destroyed. And then it was. When God allowed the Babylonians to destroy the Temple of Solomon, and they completely removed the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, the question was, where is God? Now you and I know the answer to that. Because we've been taught many years later through what happened after this time. And we've been taught through Jesus Christ. And we've learned through the gospel that God is with His people. But the Israelites didn't completely understand that. Without the temple, where is God? What will God do? Well, God promised, as we've been reading the book of Ezekiel, God promised that He would be with them. Remember all the vision that he saw of the glory of God. Ezekiel was there in captivity, and God took him by, in vision, took him by a lock of his hair, and carried him to the temple and showed him all the abominations, and then showed him in a vision that the glory that was there left the temple, got up on the wall, and then jumped across the valley, the Kidron Valley, there on what we know of as the Mount of Olives. And then the next vision he saw, he was in Babylon. Why Babylon? Because that's where his people were. Now it's a great lesson. Now from Nehemiah and Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther, we get several references, several phrases that make us aware that although the temple was destroyed, and there was no temple of God in Jerusalem, God was there. I'd like to go back to Ezra. Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. And notice the way this starts out. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Okay? Cyrus is the first king of the Persians after Babylon fell. 70 years had passed. And the next thing that happens is we're told, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. How do you do that? What do you think? The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. And why? Why did he start thinking about it? God did something, didn't he? And throughout these books, we notice God does things behind the scenes that nobody knows about. And yet this is the hand of God. And that's why we came up with the word providence. This is the invisible hand of God doing something. Now, the problem that I have with a lot of people today is that everything that they want, they're imagining God is putting it in their heart to do that. And they get that from some of this. But that's being a bit presumptuous. We know after the fact. We know, as a matter of fact, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. We can know that because, of course, we're told by inspiration. But also, we see what he did. God had promised through Isaiah, in 2 different chapters of the book of Isaiah, that Cyrus would be the name of the king. And this is 700 years before. That Cyrus would be the name of the king who would allow them to go back home again. And here he is, and now here he is doing it. How did that happen? Is this just God and his foreknowledge? No, here we see something more direct than that. It's not just foreknowledge of God. This is God actually causing things to happen by, as we see here, stirring up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia. And Ezra he was the scribe who was an expert in the laws of God, who came to teach the Israelites who had returned to their land. Many of them had stayed in Babylon and other places, and that became what was known as the diaspora, the scattered people of God. But they had begun the foundation of the temple. You have the work of Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets, working together with Ezra, and they began rebuilding the temple that was destroyed. It was whenever they had finished rebuilding that temple, you remember the old men were crying? Why were they crying?
It wasn't as beautiful as Solomon's temple.
They remembered, didn't they? They remembered the old one that was destroyed 70 years before. And they wept loudly. The young were rejoicing, but the old were crying, were weeping. Now, the book of Nehemiah, you know, there was so much more that had to be done to reestablish the people of God back in that land. They needed to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah applies to a little bit later time after Ezra. And so, in God's plan, Nehemiah was going to be that one. I'd like you to see the providence of God working through history and through Nehemiah to make this happen. Nehemiah chapter 1. The words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and mourned for the days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I may now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded through your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the people. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though you're dispersed be under the farthest skies, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place that I've chosen and make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to the servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Next phrase. Now, I was cupbearer to the king. Okay. How come Nehemiah is there that close to the king at that moment? Providence of God. God has made it possible. God has provided that something, all of the drama of the book of Nehemiah happens because somehow God made it possible that this man be found in this place, cupbearer to the king. What would that mean to you, cupbearer? Does that ring a bell? Okay. He would personally serve the king his wine. And the cupbearer had the responsibility of keeping him alive. Because there's always intrigue in these castles and these kingdoms. Always somebody trying to poison the king. The cupbearer is in charge of that. This would be someone of great confidence. The king had great confidence in him. the cupbearer would taste the wine. He would put his life in his hands in order to make sure that the king was safe. And it says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. You see, these Oriental kings were absolute monarchs, and you were not allowed to displease them even by being sad in their presence. It could be a death sentence. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my fathers' graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed? Okay. Now, what's the king going to say? Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. You think he prayed out loud? I don't think so. He's standing in the king's presence, but he now has prayed a silent prayer. Was there any value and power in that? Obviously there was. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. What did the king say? The king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone? And when will you return? This is so brief and so beautiful. It speaks of the bond that has been formed between this king and this Israelite, this Jew, who was serving as a slave, cupbearer to the king. He sees him sad, and rather than ask for the death of this one who dared to be sad in his presence, he says, why are you sad? He let him explain. And it moved him. And the first thing he said is, what do you want? What can I do for you? How can I help you? What are you asking me to do for you? He says, let me go back and rebuild the city. And he says, that's fine. How long do you need? When you're coming back. He wanted him back. He wanted Nehemiah back at his side. But he was willing to make Nehemiah happy. He was willing to let him go. This is the man who is the king of the whole Persian Empire. This is Artaxerxes. Don't know for sure whether he is the same one as the Ahasuerus of Esther, or Xerxes or Artaxerxes back there. There's a little bit of confusion there. I don't pretend to know the answers to all that. It doesn't really matter. But you do see, in Esther's case, when Mordecai asked her to go before the king and ask an audience, she was afraid. Because that was very presumptuous in that world, in that environment. You had to be someone cherished and loved by the king, or you would not get away with that. It would be instant death. It's the same kind of environment now that Nehemiah is in. He's afraid, but he dares to take a chance and risk his life and to take advantage of the confidence between him and his king. And not only does he grant him his request, he grants him all the money he might need, all the gold, the silver, the soldiers, the materials. He made sure that Nehemiah had everything he needed to go back and to build the walls. And that wasn't the end of it, of course. You see in the book of Nehemiah, there was still a lot that had to be done. In chapter 4, for example, You had a lot of enemies back there in Jerusalem, as he had heard from his friend who came back and reported, chapter 4 and verse 14. And Judah, it was verse 10, and Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. In 9 verse 14, and I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the officials, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. And fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, and your wives, and your homes. Now, what is it that Nehemiah is calling upon the people to believe in? To remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Okay? Yes. He's great and awesome. So what? What does that have to do with me? Am I doing His will? Will He help me? Can He help me? We're in Nehemiah chapter 4 right now, and verse 14 and verse 20. Then he says, in the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So upon what basis does he have courage? It's his faith that God will fight for us, that God will be on our side, that God will be our helper. It's so very important. We are told throughout the Bible, be not afraid. Don't be afraid to open your mouth and speak. Jesus had said in Matthew 10 and verse 28, don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. Fear him who can do what? Destroy body and soul in hell. If we fear the greater power, we are going to be less afraid of the lesser power. Let me take you back to Esther for a moment. We've looked at Ezra and we've looked at Nehemiah. Esther is the last of the books of history in the Old Testament. We're in that time of when Israel is still in Persia, here in the book of Esther. We just mentioned that a while ago. Chapter 5 and 6. Okay. This is Esther, who is going to, she's going to risk her life in order to appeal to the king to save her life and the lives of her people. Okay? Do you remember how Esther starts out? You know, there's the king and all of his buddies.
Big party.
They had a big party, aren't they? And they're really, they're getting drunk. And the king, the Oriental kings, they had their queen, but they had all kinds of concubines. And what were concubines? They weren't queens. They weren't the queen. But they were like slaves or servants or lesser. They were not, they didn't have the status of a queen. But the queen, Vashti, or Vashti, they called upon her to appear and show her beauty to all of his drunken friends, and she said no. And so that became an embarrassment to the king. And so she was removed from being queen. And the drama that follows in chapter 2 and 3 is that eventually, by the hand of God, a young Jewess was the most beautiful woman in the land, chosen not only for her beauty but for her grace. And she pleased him. And so she became his wife. And now we have let's see that, we start out in chapter 1 and verse 3, the third year of his reign, when this drama with Vashti occurred. In chapter 2 and verse 17, whenever the king loved Esther as his wife, it was the 7th year of his reign. So it was the 3rd year. Now it's the 7th year. How many years have passed? 4 years. Okay? From chapter 1 to the end of chapter 2, 4 years have passed. And now, when you get down to chapter 3 and verse 7, and the drama with Haman, in verse 7, 3 verse 7, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, okay? This is the lot where they would, Haman is choosing the most opportune time to slaughter all the Jews, but we're told this is in the 12th year. Now we were in the 7th year in chapter 2. Now we are in the 12th year. Do the math. 5 more years have passed. Okay? Haman has been, he's been thinking and hating Mordecai for these 5 years. And now finally he's going to put his plan into effect. And this is when Esther makes her move. Here in chapter 6 and verse 1, what's happened here is she dares to go before him, and all that she asked for, he allows her to come in, and she asked him that she might be able to prepare a banquet for him and for Haman. And they do that, and he is so happy during this banquet, he says, ask me whatever you want, and I'll give you up to the half of my kingdom. And she says, I want to give you another banquet. Okay. And meanwhile, chapter 6 and verse 1. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king, and it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, and two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? All right, that refers us back to, where is it, in chapter 2 and verse 21. This is when, in 2 and 21, in those days as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. He told it to Queen Esther. Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. And that was the end of it. Nothing was done. But on this night, before the banquet, he has a dream. Who gave him the dream? Had to be. What we're talking about tonight is the providence of God. And how does God work? And can we say that God works in this way? Yes, He does. We're shown this throughout the history of the Bible. God could cause things to happen in very indirect ways. This is not some great sign or wonder. We're not told God gave him the dream, but he did have a dream, didn't he? And he couldn't sleep. And there was something keeping him awake, and he wanted to know, what is this? And then he found out this, that he had never rewarded Mordecai for saving his life. And who was Mordecai? his queen's uncle. He didn't know that. Not only that, he was a Jew. He didn't know that either. He didn't know his wife was a Jew. Now, meanwhile, Haman has erected a high and lofty scaffold or gallows to hang Mordecai. And yet here, when the king has this dream, he calls for Haman, who was his second in command. Okay, he's the vizier, the most important authority in all the land, and he's the one who wants to kill all the Jews. He calls him and he says, I want you to honor somebody that I forgot to honor. And who is that? Mordecai. Before that, though, he really sets him up. He says, now, I want your counsel on this. How should we honor someone whom the king wants to honor? And he's thinking what? He's thinking about himself. And so, you see how this is being set up. The king acts in a way that Haman has this elaborate thing, thinking that he's going to be honored, and turns out he's got to do it for the one he's trying to kill. Now, you want to tell me something? The hand of God wasn't there? Can we say the hand of God was there? I think we can. Esther is full of the providence of God. How God saved his people. The next chapters, and of course the drama gets more and more intense. I know we won't have time to read all of this. But I wanted us to spend a little bit of time thinking about this. How about Daniel? That's another book in which, here you have, these were the princes of the royal house. These were the heirs of the royal, they were noblemen. That when Nebuchadnezzar first attacked Jerusalem and conquered them, he took these young men as hostage, and he brought them in his court, and he treated them with great honor. And he was going to prepare them to become counselors among his other wise men. And among them was Daniel. And let me take us over to Daniel 1 and verse 17 now. All we're doing is just noticing the hand of God here among a people who have been conquered. The great and vast empire of the Chaldeans has been brought to bear, and they have conquered the people of God. Where's God? What's he going to do? And the question is the faithfulness of God. And verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought to end, the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the end, and until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, where did this come from? Where did Daniel get this wisdom? Where did Hananiah get his wisdom? He got it from God. To appreciate what it is that we read here, in chapter 2, we have the image of the 4 metals, and the head of gold, you remember, was symbolic of Nebuchadnezzar himself. What's acknowledged is that Nebuchadnezzar was famous for being a very intelligent man. And in that very chapter, you see the scene where he had all of his magicians and enchanters and magi and all those guys. And when he had this dream, he wouldn't tell them what his dream was. He says, in order for me to know that you know what God wants me to understand, you tell me the dream and its interpretation. And they all just went crazy because nobody could tell him the dream. But Nebuchadnezzar was smart enough to know that his wisest and most intelligent counselors were full of garbage. And they were idolaters, they were liars, they were deceivers. The whole religion of astrology is based upon all kinds of deceit and trickery. And this Nebuchadnezzar did not know the true God, but he was smart enough to know something was wrong with the wisdom of these people. And when he examined Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, when he examined them, he knew there was different. There was something very special about them. And in the chapters that follow, you see him learning more and more about the God of these people. In chapter 2, the wisdom of Daniel, then interpreting. Daniel told him the dream. And Daniel said, I can't do that. I don't have any power to do that. That was given me by God. He began to know this God who could tell him what he dreamed about the night before and what it meant as well. And so, chapter 3 of Daniel, you had the fiery furnace, and you see the rage of this king. He was smart, but he was also a man out of control sometimes. And then, of course, God displayed his protective. I'd like us to read just a little bit, chapter 3 and verse 16, and I'll stop. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And you remember in the story what happened. That the men who threw them in the fiery furnace died. But these three men were walking around in the fire as if it was nothing. How did they do that? Well, that was of course the providence of God. God saved them. God delivered them. God does not promise to deliver us from everyone who hates us. Many great men, many thousands and thousands of Christians have died because of the evil of evil men. Like in Acts chapter 12, you have James and you have Peter, who are arrested by King Herod Agrippa the first. And right away he chops off James' head, and God did not stop him from doing that. But then his plan to also behead Peter, that night God sent his angel and Peter walked away free. God saved Peter. Why did he do that? We don't know. It's like here you have the three young men saying, God is able, but if not, we're going to be faithful to him anyway. And that's what we have got to learn as Christians. Yes, God is able, God cares, he has his plans, he has his providence, he's faithful, he will take care of us, but mainly he will carry out his purpose and plans to bring blessing and salvation to those who are lost.